In 327 BC, a Greek historian stood upright when Alexander the Great expected a bow. His name was Callisthenes. Within months, he was dead. The gesture had a name, proskynesis. In the Persian imperial world, it could mark formal court submission. To Greeks and Macedonians, a deep bow could look like honor owed to gods. Callisthenes had followed Alexander's campaign as a man of words, not a rival general. But as Alexander's court moved east, the danger was no longer only what a man said, it was how he stood. A companion who stood upright could look less like a trusted friend than a public challenge. Callisthenes would be arrested after the conspiracy of the royal pages, a case ancient sources describe differently and never fully settle. His fall was not the only one. Philotas, Parmenion, Clytus, Callisthenes. How did a conqueror of enemies begin treating the men around him like traitors? That question is dangerous because the easy answer is too simple. 2,000 years later, we cannot put Alexander on a couch, and the surviving story is not a tabloid file about a conqueror suddenly going mad. What we have are later ancient writers, copied through time, each preserving pieces of a court that was already political when they described it. Arrian gives a disciplined military narrative, often making Alexander's decisions look rational. Plutarch watches character, temper, ambition, shame, remorse. Curtius Rufus, writing in the Roman world, leans harder into the tragedy of power becoming tyranny. None gives us a clean courtroom transcript. So the issue is not simply, was Alexander cruel? The sharper question is, what changed around him until men who had ridden, argued, and bled beside him could begin to look like threats? The trail runs through empire, ritual, fear, and Macedonian identity. Before the bow, before Callisthenes, before the court moved east, there was an older world that taught Alexander what a Macedonian king was supposed to be. That older world begins in Macedon, where a king was expected to live close to the men who made him powerful. He ruled on horseback, in council, at campaign tables, and in front of armed nobles whose loyalty had to be earned again and again. Macedonian politics could be brutal. Kings were murdered, rivals disappeared. Noble families watched the throne closely because proximity could mean power or danger. Still, the king depended on a military aristocracy near enough to advise him, pressure him, and sometimes insult him to his face. These were the companions, elite horsemen, commanders, banquet partners, and power brokers. Picture bronze helmets near a council table, cavalry gear stacked outside a tent, the same men riding beside the king and then sitting close enough at dinner to challenge him. Access was part of their status. Alexander inherited much of this from Philip II. Philip had transformed Macedonia from a vulnerable northern kingdom into the dominant military power in Greece. He built the army, trained the officers, and raised a generation of commanders who knew what they had helped create. When Alexander took the throne in 336 BC, many important men around him were Philip's old guard. Parmenion was already a towering general. His son Philotas commanded the companion cavalry. Clytus the Black belonged to that same rough world of Macedonian military intimacy. Their loyalty was real. Closeness, though, carried danger. They could honor Alexander as king while remembering him as Philip's son. They could obey him in battle and still judge him by the standards of the camp, the banquet, and the Macedonian assembly. Blunt speech could cost a man dearly. It had not yet become sacrilege. Then Alexander's victories dragged that old war table culture into an empire too large to be governed by a circle of armed Macedonian nobles. Once the campaign map hardened into an empire, Alexander faced a problem no Macedonian war council had been built to solve. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana, these were not trophies on a conquered road. They were administrative centers for royal roads, tax districts, palace officials, local elites, and subject peoples who had never sworn loyalty in the rough Macedonian style. Defeating Darius had made Alexander king of Asia in name. Keeping Asia required more than Macedonian spears. So Alexander began to take on parts of the world he had conquered. Ancient sources describe him adopting elements of Persian dress, using Persian nobles in his service, and experimenting with Persian court etiquette. To Macedonian veterans, some of this looked like dangerous softening, even betrayal of Philip's military world. Politically, it had a logic. Achaemenid kingship already had a language millions understood, distance from the throne, ranked access, visible hierarchy, and rituals that told every courtier where he stood. The danger was translation. In the Persian court, proskynesis could function as a gesture of rank and royal reverence inside an imperial system. It did not have to mean the person bowing believed the king was a god, but to Greeks and Macedonians, bowing low before a living man carried a different charge. That kind of submission belonged uncomfortably close to worship, and worship was for the gods. One movement, two messages. To a Persian courtier, I recognize the hierarchy of empire. To a Macedonian companion, I am no longer a free warrior speaking to my king. I am a subject lowering myself before something more than human. Alexander stood between those meanings. He needed Persian legitimacy without losing Macedonian obedience. He needed old companions to accept new distance. As the court changed, refusal no longer looked like ordinary bluntness. It could be read as contempt for the king's new order. Before the bow becomes fatal for Callisthenes, suspicion first finds another target, a powerful son of Philip's old guard, commanding the cavalry at the center of Alexander's army. The first major figure caught in that atmosphere was Philotas, son of Parmenion. Philotas was not a minor courtier. He commanded the companion cavalry, the elite striking arm that often decided Alexander's battles. His father, Parmenion, was even more formidable, Philip's veteran general, a man who had helped build the Macedonian war machine before Alexander inherited it. In 330 BC, while the army was deep in Asia, a plot against Alexander was reported. The accusation that destroyed Philotas was not simply that he had planned the king's death. In several ancient accounts, the central charge was that he had heard warnings of a conspiracy and failed to report them properly. That distinction matters. If Philotas knowingly concealed a threat, Alexander faced a real security crisis. A king campaigning thousands of miles from Macedon could not ignore silence around an assassination plot. But if the evidence was confused, exaggerated, or shaped by enemies at court, the same charge became a way to break one of the strongest families in the army. The sources do not let us settle the charge cleanly. Arrian, Plutarch, and Curtius preserve different emphases, and the procedure looks troubling even at this distance. Philotas was interrogated, condemned before the Macedonian army, and executed. What began as accusation became a public lesson in what failed loyalty could cost. Then Alexander made the colder decision. Parmenion was far away at Ecbatana, guarding treasure, troops, and a crucial line of control. He had not stood beside his son at the trial. He had no chance to defend himself before Alexander. But after Philotas fell, Parmenion's power became the danger. Leave him alive, and Alexander risked a senior commander with loyal soldiers, vast resources, and reason to fear what came next. Kill him first, and the threat disappeared before it could form. So messengers were sent east with sealed orders. At Ecbatana, Parmenion was killed before news of Philotas's execution could become action. This is where security and purge become almost impossible to separate. Alexander may have faced a genuine conspiracy. He also removed, in one stroke, the most powerful surviving pillar of Philip's old guard. After Philotas and Parmenion, every companion could read the message. Past service did not guarantee safety. Command did not guarantee trust. Closeness to Alexander could turn into evidence against you. The next rupture would not come through sealed orders. It would happen face to face, over wine, between Alexander and a man who had once saved his life. Clytus, known as Clytus the Black, was not a court outsider. At the Battle of the Granicus, when Alexander was young, exposed, and nearly cut down, ancient tradition says Clytus struck down the Persian attacker and saved the king's life. His loyalty had been proven in close combat. Years later, in 328 BC, that same man sat at a banquet in Maracanda, far from Macedonia, in a court that no longer felt fully Macedonian. Wine moved around the room. Praise gathered around Alexander. Clytus began to push back. The sources differ in tone and detail, so their reported speeches are not transcripts. But the shape of the quarrel is clear. Clitus objected to Alexander's growing Persian style and to the way the king's achievements seemed to overshadow Philip II, the father whose army and generals had made the conquest possible. That complaint struck the fault line in Alexander's new identity. Was he still the son of Philip, leading Macedonian companions who could answer him sharply, or was he becoming an imperial ruler whose glory stood above old obligations and old voices? In Clitus's Macedonian world, a companion could drink with the king, argue with him, and wound his pride. In Alexander's changing court, the same bluntness landed in a more dangerous place. Criticism of the king's customs could sound like rejection of the king himself. Then the banquet broke. Alexander killed Clitus with a spear. The sources later dwell on his horror and grief, and that remorse matters, because this was not a calculated execution like Parmenian's. It was an intimate rupture, sudden and irreversible. The man who had once saved Alexander's life died because he could not accept what Alexander was becoming. Clitus matters because his death shows the ideological split turning personal. A proven friend could survive battle, conspiracy, and years of campaign hardship, yet become intolerable when he stood in the path of Alexander's sacred imperial self-image. The spilled wine at Maracanda pointed toward the ritual question tightening around the court. If Alexander was no longer first among companions, how were those companions supposed to stand before him? Proskinesis made that question visible. Court etiquette became something you could see in the body: who stood, who bent, who approached the throne, and how low. In a Persian imperial setting, formal obeisance could mark rank, hierarchy, and loyalty inside a vast court. It did not have to mean every subject thought the king was a god. For many Greeks and Macedonians, though, the same posture carried a sharper religious meaning. To bend or prostrate yourself before a man looked too close to worship, and worship belonged to the gods. Alexander was trying to hold together an empire no Macedonian king had ever ruled. Persian nobles had to see a king who understood Persian kingship. Macedonian companions had to see a king they could still follow as their own. In one room, one gesture was being asked to speak two political languages. Callisthenes turned the fracture into a public problem. He was not an outsider pamphleteer or a modern dissident in ancient clothing. He was a Greek intellectual inside Alexander's expedition, connected to Aristotle's world, useful to the king's image, and bold enough to object when the ritual was pressed on Greeks and Macedonians. Ancient accounts differ in detail, but the outline is clear. Callisthenes resisted the performance of proskinesis, and his resistance embarrassed Alexander's experiment. Alexander appears to have retreated from imposing it broadly on the Macedonians, at least for the moment. The court had still staged the question in public. After that, posture carried a record. Bowing could be read as acceptance of the new hierarchy. Refusal could come from old Macedonian freedom, Greek religious scruple, personal dignity, or political caution. From Alexander's side of the throne, the same refusal may have looked like a public denial of his imperial identity. That was the trap. The old companion culture had treated bluntness as dangerous but survivable. The new sacred imperial court gave bluntness a darker label. A man standing upright could be filed, later, among the dangerous. The court did not need a clean ideology to become frightening. Suspicion, wounded authority, and a usable accusation were enough. Soon, that accusation came through the royal pages. The accusation came from inside the royal household, from young men with access to Alexander's body. These were the royal pages, sons of noble Macedonian families, trained in service around the king, close enough to attend him, guard him, and resent him. In 327 BC, several were accused of plotting to kill Alexander. In the ancient accounts, the story begins with grievance. One page had been punished after a hunting incident, and anger hardened into conspiracy. That may be true. Young aristocrats living under a king whose temper and authority had grown more dangerous had reasons to fear him, hate him, or imagine glory in removing him. The sources do not let us see the whole room clearly. Arrian, Plutarch, and Curtius preserve different emphases and moral lessons. The plot may have been real, enlarged by fear, or turned into the opportunity Alexander's court needed. The pages were arrested. The accusation then reached Callisthenes. That link mattered more than any confession we cannot verify. Callisthenes had already made himself visible as the man who resisted the ritual language of Alexander's new court. He was Aristotle's relative, the official historian of the campaign, a Greek voice with prestige, and a public reminder that not everyone accepted the king's divine-style elevation. The ancient tradition disagrees on the details. Callisthenes was arrested. He died in captivity. Some accounts imply disease or imprisonment. Others make the end harsher. What we can say with confidence is colder than any invented prison scene. The man who would not bend vanished under an accusation of treason. After that, silence became a court skill, a careless line at dinner, a philosophical objection, a joke remembered by the wrong listener. Each could sit quietly in the room until another plot needed names. The old Macedonian privilege of speaking roughly to the king had not vanished in written law. It had become unsafe in practice. Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean toward India, but the space around him contracted. The larger the map became, the fewer men could stand near him without calculating every word. By 327 BC, the court was no longer simply companions around a war leader. It was becoming a chamber of watched faces, uncertain testimony, and men deciding whether honesty was worth their lives. At the end of the trail, the map is enormous and the circle around Alexander is smaller. Philotas and Parmenion mark the place where military power could be interpreted as a security threat. Clitus marks the banquet table, where old loyalty spoke too honestly against the king's new image. Callisthenes marks the ritual line, where the bow exposed the difference between companion and subject. None of this requires the easy label of madness. The ancient evidence is too difficult, and the politics too real. Alexander was ruling an empire that could not be held by Macedonian camp customs alone. Persian hierarchy offered a language of authority. Divine-style honors offered distance. Conspiracy fears offered justification. Together, they rewrote loyalty. In that system, the friend who questioned could look like a rebel. The veteran who remembered Philip could sound like an enemy of Alexander. The man who refused to bow could be treated as more than rude. He could be treated as disloyal. Alexander conquered Persia. The record suggests that conquest also changed the court around him, until the Macedonian world that had made him powerful could no longer safely stand beside him. That is the final tragedy behind the divine image. Absolute power does not only hunt enemies, it teaches friends how to kneel, and punishes the ones who remain standing.